Welcome to the Faith and Trauma Center podcast, a unique approach to exploring the intersections of religion, trauma, sacred spaces, and mental health.
Each month, we choose a different topic to discuss weekly from different perspectives. The first week, we explore the faith, community, and clergy perspective. The second week, the mental health practitioner perspective. The third week, the perspective of individuals working to heal from religious trauma. And the fourth week, we invite a special guest who has been impacted by our monthly topic to join us.
This format follows the design of the Faith and Trauma Center's 3 pathways for resources and education. We invite you to explore all the additional material that we offer at faithandtraumacenter.org.
Let's jump into this week's conversation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Faith and Trauma podcast. We are starting a new month and thus starting a new topic. And so we are going to dive into that in just a minute. But we kind of want to take a second to just kind of check in with each other, but also want to just begin with issuing a trigger warning. So much of the work that we do revolves around trauma, specifically religious trauma and the roots of that. And so we just recognize that as we're talking, because we don't really pre-plan exactly what we're going to say, that there may be triggers that come up. And so we just want to invite you to be really gentle with yourself. And so if you need to pause the episode and come back to it, if you ever need to skip an episode, if you need to carve out time intentionally to have some really self-love, self-care intention after these episodes or during, to just make sure that you are tending to your nervous system during that process, we just want to give you space to do that and celebrate when you recognize those places, because I think we're all in this place of kind of navigating what that looks like to live as survivors of religious trauma. So that being said, it's kind of been a day, I think, for both of us. So how are you, friend?
Hi, everybody.
Are you? I feel like we should introduce ourselves too. Sorry.
Yeah. Hey, for those of you that are new, I'm Christy Love, co-founder of the Faith and Trauma Center, and you are?
Holly Madden, also co-founder.
So my day today has been a little hard on the heart, but also good. I have talked on here before. I have 4 amazing, beautiful, wonderful adult children, all of them now. And so it's, one of those seasons that's a lot of fun to watch them fly and launch. And sometimes that means coming back for a little while and getting some bonus time and then launching again. And today was one of those days for me where my oldest has gotten to be back around our house. He would not say he was at our house, but he was in proximity for the last couple of years, and that's just been a really sweet time. And yeah, he set off on a great adventure today. He bought a camper and is going to be traveling and doing some rock climbing, and we're working remotely and kind of following his dreams and living his Enneagram 7's best life. And yeah, so, the planner in me who would like to know all the things, a little anxious about that, but I'm excited to see him do what he loves. So.
Yeah, so hard day, good day, but hard day. I also have had kind of an emotional day. So it's like really cloudy here today and it's been in the 60s. We call it false fall here, where you get the like hint of like it's cooling down. So I'm in a sweater and I'm gonna eat soup tonight and it's wonderful. But that just has like really resonated with kind of my spirit. We've been in the throes of back to school. We're in we're finishing the second week, and it's the first full week. And so I think we're all just feeling really tired. We've been really busy. And so that's been like my nervous system is just like craving just some like slowness and some rest. And then I have a new niece. And so that happened today. I finished school and checked my phone and got a sweet text message. And so feeling the emotions of distance right now. Also would love to come and have coffee with you, Christy, but a little bit
Really pricey. Can we fly you here for the weekend? And that's just a little pricey.
Do you remember when plane tickets were a lot cheaper? And so yeah, kind of just feeling that out and being present with that in myself. So definitely some emotions. also been feeling a little triggered this week. So we had our last, in full transparency, you'll learn this about me. I have ADHD, and that's both beautiful and a superpower, and also sometimes very frustrating. And so we were in our last podcast, and I was like, "Oh, we had a topic. We talked about a topic. So I'll ask Christy what the topic is." And then she's like, "We didn't have a topic planned." And so she, we have a list. So she pulled from the list of like what would be a good conversation. And then this week came, and we decided we needed to shift that. And so we are not talking about prayer at this time. We'll bring that back up at another point. But felt a little triggered this week because the news just honored the life and the passing of Dr. James Dobson, who was the founder of Focus on the Family, an organization, the headquarters that was in the city I grew up in. And so I grew up with a lot of that. And experienced a lot of trauma from that organization, just and from the fallout of a lot of what was talked about from a child psychologist who had some very conservative views on things. And so we're navigating that right now. And so yeah, we've decided we're going to shift the topic. So Christy, do you want to kind of start us out?
Yeah. So, yeah, Dr. Dobson, the news of his passing came at the end of last week. And when it came, I was actually in the middle of a meeting with an individual who's working through a great deal of religious trauma in their own life. And the emotion that evoked in this conversation that I was having personally, but also the emotion that it evoked in many, many people who took to social media to just really share their own stories of trauma, the ways that Focus on the Family, Dr. Dobson, the parenting techniques that were taught as a result, were just incredibly harmful. And so I feel like this week has definitely been a week of holding space for acknowledging and understanding what that looked like past tense and still looks like present tense for some people who grow up in what I typically call a faith-filled household. And so we're going to spend this month's topic kind of looking at growing up in a faith-filled household and what are some considerations for us to be thinking about. What are some of the unique experiences that this exposes people to? And so in this week's particular episode, we're going to have this conversation with faith leaders and what are some things we need to be aware of and cognizant of when we're working with people. And then we'll talk about mental health professionals and what are some things they maybe need to think about when they're working with clients who possibly grew up in a very faith-filled household, a very conservative faith-filled household. We'll talk about that lived experience piece this month and kind of share some similarities and some experiences that you and I had in our own upbringing and in my own raising of kids. Like I just said, mine are adults now. So I kind of caught the tail end of Dr. Dobson as it came through parenting. And then at the end of the month, we'll have a guest on to share their story of how growing up in a faith-filled household really shaped them and has been something they've had to not only deconstruct, but they've really had to heal from. So that's kind of where we're going to go this month.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, just issuing that trigger warning. If that is a culture you were raised in, you had exposure to, maybe you even parented in, and experienced those resources that came about, just be gentle with yourself if you find this triggering. So Christy, I would love to just hear from you as we're speaking to clergy members, to pastors, specifically in this conversation. Just, you kind of shared a little bit of your response, but like, I know that there's also just, I think that there's oftentimes this elevation we have of leaders inside of faith communities, and there's not always this awareness to that the trauma or to the oppressiveness or the harm that those leaders have brought, especially when they become really, that hierarchy just gets really, really, really high up. And I just be really curious, like your heart as a pastor, as you're processing that news and seeing both people that are saying, hey, this was really traumatic for me, and then also seeing the reverse of that, where people are like sharing, hey, we want to honor his life, his legacy, like the world is grieving his death. And seeing, and every person's life matters. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say, but just like we want to honor his work. And so maybe resources are being shared again, or conversations. And I know then there's people that are kind of on that place of like, oh, social media is not safe. And so just like speaking as a pastor, like where's your heart right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think my heart's a little bit messy for a couple of reasons. Number one, for me, I think that it's really important that as a faith leader, I am constantly holding the duality, and that I try to keep the duality of the work that we do in focus and in frame at all times. And
Mhm.
what I mean specifically by that for this topic is I have to be able to hold the tension of the work that I feel called to do in a trauma informed manner, in a way that says, we're going to do some new practices, we're going to break some cycles in my ministry of context. But at the same time, I cannot do that without constantly being aware of the harm that has come before me. And I
Mhm.
cannot do that without being aware of the teachings, the experiences, the weaponization, the twisting, the contorting of so many different pieces um, that are formative to people in their faith, right? And sometimes that is scripture, sometimes that is faith-based practices, and sometimes that is knowledge that is shared in a framework of faith, specifically in this case, parenting knowledge, that tried to really mold and shape generations of parents and the way that they saw their children, not just as, beautiful gifts to steward and shape and love on, but also an extension of their faith. I
Mhm.
think some of the things that were really complicated about the way that Dr. Dobson and Focus on the Family often portrayed things was that your worth as a parent and your success as a parent was then dependent upon the faith of your children.
Mhm.
And so, um, for me, to answer your question specifically, Holly, for me, my heart is messy, I think, because as a faith leader, right, I cannot do one without acknowledging the other. And so this week for me, and constantly trying to say, we need to do different because we have to acknowledge what we've done has been harmful and has been hurtful. And there, I think, are a lot of emotions that I have run into
Mhm.
since the news of his passing. I have ran into a lot of anger, a
Mhm.
lot of frustration, especially kids that were raised in that system. I have run into a lot of guilt and a lot of shame for parents who practiced some of these principles and teachings and then later realized, wow, that may not have been the healthiest way to do that. That actually may have been really harmful to my kiddo, especially if my kiddo was someone that maybe was more marginalized, someone, especially like our queer community, or some of these statements that came out later in life from Dr. Dobson, and recognizing and kind of connecting those dots back. Uh,
Mhm.
so yeah, so for me, one of the things I would encourage fellow clergy and faith leaders is, even if you're someone who says, we need to honor everyone's legacy, I can respect that, but part of that means we have to be honest about the totality of our legacy. And if we have lived our life in a way that our legacy also has to acknowledge that help came also with harm, we
Mhm.
can't pick one over the other. We can't prioritize one over the other. We have to be willing to have a holistic, truthful conversation about what that's looked like.
Yeah. Well, and I think I know our conversation is specifically around parenting. But I also, and like for me, a lot of my experience was the integration of so much of the resources of Focus on the Family in even more like educational settings. Like there was a lot of those pieces too. And Focus on the Family grew so much and created so much. I mean, like there was the I was trying to look it up because I was trying to remember the name of it, like the Adventures in Odyssey series that was very, very, very popular when I was growing up, and I listened to that a lot in my private Christian school. We had a lot of resources that when I went into church settings, and so I think that there's this really complicated dynamic, and maybe you can speak to this more, Christy, too, and just like this, like let's talk about what happened with Focus on the Family, but let's also talk about like how do we prevent those kind of resources from being harmful because what I think happened so much is it grew so much. There was so much out here. There's people, and to not play the blame game, there's so many parents that bought into that because there's this anxiety piece that's often this, am I raising my children the right way? Maybe I don't have a good model for how to raise children, so I'm looking for what's out there. I'm trying to find something that's a good answer. And here I'm going to church or I'm coming to this community and here's all these resources and here's, my kids love this series and like growing up in Colorado Springs, here's this actual like physical location you can go to that had like a play place and it was like this whole thing. And there's so much around that, so much publicity around that it's like, oh, I can trust this, like I can buy into this, like how much of that popularity is there and how deceptive that can be when you're trying to pull out, is this safe, is this good, and just kind of the dynamics of those relationships. Does that make sense? Kind of, it's not a question, but it kind of is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know what you're trying to kind of get at. I think, one of the things I think we've always got to be really cautious about as faith leaders is what we are willing to recommend and what we are willing to throw our support
Mhm.
behind and what we are willing to put into people's hands as a tool to help them, especially in times of high vulnerability. And I would argue that um, parenting is definitely a time of high vulnerability, right? It's high stress, it's high demand. You're trying to do things that maybe you've never done before, um, especially if you're trying to parent kids that maybe don't fit the mold of what you thought or you expected, or you have a younger kid who doesn't kind of seem just to follow the same pattern that their older sibling did. I think this is where a lot of times I really struggle, because I think part of what made Focus on the Family so huge, right, was that so many faith leaders delegated out to Focus
Mm,
on the Family this expertise level of Christian parenting, right? And so instead of us having to develop resources or content or helping to connect families to local resources or recognizing the fact that no two kids are exactly alike. And,
mm,
you know, even the greatest parenting advice in the whole world has to be personalized and contextualized for your kid, because
mm,
every kid is unique. And so I think part of the challenge is that leading a congregation that has a lot of young families and is navigating complex parenting dynamics and lots of stressful relationships and all the things, that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of our time and our energy and our willingness to walk beside families in that, our willingness to get to know kids and get to know their parents. I mean, that's an investment in time in ministry. And so I think there's something about organizations like Focus on the Family, or the predecessor to Focus on the Family was the Institute for Basic Life Principles from Bill Gothard, equally, if not more harmful. And again, when there seems like there's like a pressure release valve that, oh, we can just send families here, we can send them here. If we're not screening to make sure those are safe spaces, we're not screening to make sure that those are safe to all people that might be in our church and how they could be, talked about or reacted to in certain systems. And again, if we're not finding a way to help personalize and interpret and translate that into personal situations, I think
mhm.
it just becomes really complicated. And so um, I think that's something we've got to be really aware of as a danger. And I think that's part of what led to this massive growth of focus on the family as you had this rise of the evangelical movement, which churches started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you've got evangelicalism on the rise, church size growing. You start to get into mega churches. You start to get into this place of how do we streamline and how do we, create content that is reusable and take things
Mm.
off of our plate. And then you had these outside parachurch organizations like Focus on the Family who said, hey, we can support parenting information. We can support these things. And they began to build up this massive following. They began to build up a huge collection of people through their radio, through their writing, through all of the things that they did, their parenting seminars. And then the train is way down the track before some people, I think, realized, oh man, some of this
Mhm.
stuff is actually really harmful. Like there's a lot of pieces talking about corporal punishment in here. There's a lot of pieces in here that aren't necessarily honoring or talking about neurodiversity in any way. Or there's a lot of pieces in here about breaking the will of a child and how that can be incredibly harmful to kids. And so I think all
Yeah.
of those pieces are things we have to be aware of.
Yeah. And I think of the even just like those pieces of like how influential the interpretation of the Bible is when like little ears are listening and just how much they're looking to like if mom and dad trust this person or trust this resource, like I'm absorbing that and just how important it is that even those interpretation pieces are so critical. And all that to say though, like there is good in the church and not every single local church there can be a lot of harm and there can be a lot of not deconstructed belief systems that haven't that are still perpetuating harm, but like I think I just want to like I don't know, throw that out there because I think I've even navigated that now as a parent because I'm a child that grew up in Focus on the Family, and now I'm parenting younger children, and I'm parenting a kiddo who is starting to ask a lot of questions about faith and starting to, and a lot of when she asks me questions, a lot of what I say is, well, what do you believe? Because I want to give her the autonomy to start to feel like she has that control and she has that power because that's not how I was raised in the 90s and the early 2000s. Like that the culture of that was so like here's truth, you need to have truth, and I've not tried to replicate that, but there are still so many people that are just seeking like how do I raise my children, what is the role of the church and church leaders in that experience of parenting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think you said something really important, and those are words you and I talk about a lot, consent and autonomy, and the
Mhm.
role that those have to play, not only in parenting, but in ministry, especially as it relates to children and youth.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have consistently found in the research work that I do around religious trauma looks at these different groups of people who have shown statistical patterns to have higher outcomes of whether those are mental health outcomes that are higher than others, socioeconomic outcomes, physical health outcomes, or lower faith related outcomes. One of those groups that we've identified as hyper vulnerable is a group that we say we've labeled as grew up in a faith filled household but could not leave until they were old enough to have their own consent or autonomy. So after the age of 18 usually is when that group is labeled. And so this group is a really unique group of people that statistically emerge from their stories and their experiences, and they're saying, I was forced to go to church. I was forced to go to youth group. I was forced to go to, kids ministry. I didn't have a say in that. I didn't necessarily feel like I could question anything. It wasn't open for discussion. There were pieces maybe of myself that I didn't feel I could be fully honest about or totally vulnerable about. And so as a result, I really kind of felt like I was a square peg in a round hole. I was putting on a mask. I was playing a part every time I showed up in that space. And I was just counting down until I could leave that space because I just never felt fully like myself. I never felt fully seen or fully valued in that space. And so one of the things that Holly, you and I talk about a lot, and we do some training around at Faith and Trauma Center, is what does that look like to create children's programming, youth programming that take into account these issues of consent? take into
Mhm.
account these issues of autonomy that say, like you do with Ellie, right? Tell me what you think about this. And so it is less trying to create a carbon copy of me telling you what to believe. And it's more building relationships that support you while you ask questions and explore faith, and that you have people to talk to, and that system, those spaces, are also teaching parents that it's okay to have those conversations and to not always have all the answers. And what does that look like to provide, a loving, supportive space
Mhm.
for their kids to explore those things and find interest in divine connection on their own terms a little bit. And I think
Yeah.
that's so incredibly important.
Yeah. Which I think also then is this huge lesson in like learning to deconstruct anxiety around faith. Because I think what has fueled so much of the Christian parenting movements is this anxiety of like, but I want my children to be saved, or I want like that fear of the afterlife, that fear of being disconnected, like whatever that is for you, for your parents specifically, like there's this anxiety piece that just I think is so rampant, and in true capitalism there's a lot out there that feeds off of that, and then it becomes this thing where you're investing money into resources and tools and stuff because you feel like you're giving your children what they need, instead of that piece of like deconstructing that and wanting to give them that system of like, I don't want you to believe because I believe. I want you to believe what you genuinely believe and believe it with your whole heart. And there is a lot of like letting go of that. And I've seen that modeled in you as a mom who has older children, adults now in your life. And I'm in that season now where like I'm starting to realize how intentional my parenting, my words, how I talk about what I believe, what we're around and what other people talk about, like how influential that is on my kiddos. But you're coming at it from a parent of adults now, so maybe you can speak into that differently.
Yeah. I mean, like I said at the beginning, we've got 4 adult children. And I made a decision really, really early in ministry. And I made this decision after I realized my earlier mistakes. And so, I grew up at the tail end, like for me being parented, kind of was like the beginning of Dobson, kind of towards the end of the Institute for Basic Life Principles kind of movement. So kind of straddling that, early season of the moral majority and a lot of those kind of things that my parents were somewhat engaged in. And so I had some of those experiences from being raised in those kind of homes. Um, and it was what I knew, right? So when my kids were first really, really little, um, initially it was like, yeah, we need to go to church. We need to read them Bible stories. We need to play lullaby music that is, psalm quotes and, all of these kind of things, because that was, again, that was what I was raised with.
Mhm.
Um, but I remember very vividly when one of my kiddos was about 7 or 8, my oldest, and having a conversation where he just kind of expressed some frustration at not feeling like he could question. And
Mhm.
I didn't realize I was doing that, right? Because that was the exact opposite of what I wanted to do. And so I really kind of processed that feedback instead of getting defensive or frustrated, and kind of looked at some things and tried to figure out, how could I change my language a little bit? How could I change my approaches a little bit? And so fast forward numerous years down the road, um, and we had some experiences that I'm not going to go into, but like my own kids lived through not only some traumatic events, but some traumatic events that also had some religious trauma that accompanied them. And so they heard a lot of phrases like, we're praying for you, we're praying for a miracle, we're praying for this, we're praying for that. So when we do get to the topic of prayer trauma, right? Like that's a thing. And
Yeah.
it's hard sometimes for kids when their brains are developing, that cognitive dissonance of like, well, if we pray for it and it's not happening, then like, what does that mean? What does that shape? Um,
Mhm.
But I specifically, my middle kiddo, has always kind of been my deep spiritual thinker. And that started out reading some C.S. Lewis books and then wanted to read some other things and got into high school and wanted to explore some other faith traditions and got into college and practiced Islam for a while, explored some other faith traditions. And he's just kind of been, on a journey. And for me, it was always really, really important to let him be on a journey because his journey was his own. And his journey didn't define who I was as a mom or as a pastor. Um, it was important to me that I not try to supersede that or direct that. And recently, a few months ago, he called me up one day. I was at the office at the church and he said, "Hey, do you have a Bible?" And I was like, "Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I got a Bible." And he was like, "Do you have an extra one that you could bring me?" And I was like, "Sure." Didn't think anything about it because it's not abnormal for him to want to read and compare and study things. And so I brought him home one, and the next day I came home and he had like all of these things underlined and circled and questions written out. And he spent most of the summer just digging through the gospels and kind of like rediscovering Jesus and rediscovering this tradition rooted in the teachings of Jesus. And then he came to me and said, "I want to get baptized. And would you baptize me?" And that was, a beautiful request and an unbelievable honor. But when I baptized my adult son at church last week, I did make the statement in front of everyone. Like,
Mm.
if you're raising kids, if you're responsible for shaping the faith journey of little people in your life of any age, like, hear my heart in this. Don't force faith.
Mhm.
Give faith room to be organic and personal and their own. Because, Holly, man, I grew up thinking I just had to carbon copy like a Xerox machine
Mhm.
what my parents believed. And I found myself as a young adult and the bottom fell out of my life. And a carbon copy did nothing for me because it wasn't personal.
Yeah.
And so, again, we're talking to faith leaders today. I think really pushing back on this narrative of like parenting as a mission field, parenting as, an extension of your faith. I want you to think of it not in that way, but rather think of it as, how do I, as a caregiver, whatever role you play in someone's life, how do I hold space that doesn't tell people what to think, but gives people permission to seek and gives people permission to dig and figure it out, even if some of those things and some of those paths that they take may not fully align with what you think, where you are. Leaving those doors to conversation open is critical.
Mhm.
Having space to be the person that people can come to in conversation is so important. And when we're not forcing faith or trying to make it look like a checklist, right? We're allowing for things to become organic and holy and sacred. And we're reducing the amount of trauma that says you have to follow these steps so that
Yeah.
I feel better and truthfully, so that I look better as a parent.
Yeah. I love that. And I like honestly have learned so much from watching you parent, and now parenting my own children, like trying hard to instill that now, has been really important to me. I think I would love to just like from a young parent or a parent with younger kiddos, um, I would love to just say to like faith leaders and to church leaders that first of all, I think there's an assumption that you're supposed to know the answers to all the things and parenting being one of them. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? Or how do we do this? And I think it's so important that we have this like, please, we don't expect you to know. A lot of it is wanting to have community, wanting to have solidarity, understanding some of those really important pieces of just like we need to know we're not in this alone. Like parenting's hard. You have a child or you adopt a child or you're caring for children and maybe in a different type of a relational dynamic and a lot of it's just this like, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out my own attachment styles and my personality and my own trauma. And then I have to figure out how to support this child and in my care. And to have someone say, like, I don't have the right answer for that, but here's what I do know. And I think what parents today are craving, and we're in this world that is there is so much trauma, there's so much exposure kids have to the internet and to all of the things in this world. There's so much craving of parents to say, like, I want to know that you're going to keep my kids safe or that you're going to love my child. You and I both parent neurodiverse kids. Like, I want to know that they're loved for who they are, that they're understood, that there's patience and there's time and there's space for them to just be themselves. And so much of that is conversations around inclusion, around love, around, wholeness and who you are and holiness and just who you are and that freedom, that permission to question, ask questions. What do you believe? Why do you believe it? Thank you for telling me that and learning those things. And I think that if church leaders were willing to model that and to lead that, like that would change a lot of even the movement now of parents that are right now saying like, okay, that was too much. Like that was dramatic. That was hard, but now I'm trying to figure out how I'm supposed to do it.
Right, exactly. I mean, and I think if we're really, really honest, you talk about focus on the family, you talk about Dr. Dobson, one of the things I think we have to acknowledge is when we're looking right now at the rising number of family estrangements, that is the Dr. Dobson generation
Mm,
that as adult children
mm,
have had to create boundaries in their lives and in their families from people who were supposed to keep them safe, from
mm,
people who were supposed to love them unconditionally, for people who were supposed to be there and accept them and support them. But oftentimes their faith precluded them from inviting people to Thanksgiving because of their gender identity or because of their sexuality or because of their, whatever. Um, you've got parents who were revering this figure and this figure whose books and radio programs and teachings really influence parental behavior, who later in life made incredibly problematic statements.
mhm,
And when some of those statements were made, like, you know, when Sandy Hook happened, God help us, you know, Dr. Dobson goes publicly and says that that happened because of gay people in this country. And so you have adult children who are then, I think, having accountability conversations with
mm.
parents and saying, how can you support this?
Yeah.
But again, instead of there being open dialogue, it
Mhm,
is just this very defensive, I don't know how to have this conversation because Dr. Dobson didn't equip me to how to do that, how to have good, healthy dialogue with my children of any age. And so, again, circling this back around to faith leaders, I think this is also really critical and really key because as we see this kind of huge response on social media and people that are saying, here was my experience growing up under that. Many of those adult individuals are raising families and are trying to break cycles and are trying to parent, but many of them are doing so without a support system because many of them have had to separate from their parents, their biological support systems over these very issues.
mhm,
So for you as faith leaders, it's so critical that you are providing safe spaces for people to connect, for people to process, for people to be heard and to be seen, and that you're giving people that space to grieve,
mhm.
be angry, to say that they're lonely and they're isolated and they're scared, and
Yeah.
to try to find ways to help fill those gaps because those gaps are huge and they exist. And unfortunately, that's part of the legacy of
Mhm.
Focus on Family.
Yeah. And I would just add, I know I want to be sensitive to time, but I would add that Oftentimes I think there's this like expectation that like, oh, the needs right now are the like how to's. So many families, the needs are the physical needs. And I think that those are things that the church can be really intentional to meet. To like, I'm not going to create a parenting class or try to find curriculum. Like, we're going to try to make sure that, all of the families we're loving on have enough food, or we're going to do fun activities where we do parents' night out and provide a free childcare evening so that parents have the capacity to do some things that they don't normally get to do because childcare is so expensive, or like looking to, and that's so unique because it's going to be so unique to if you're a pastor, a clergy, or faith leader, like who you're loving on every single day, what community you're in, what neighborhood you're in, but just looking for some of those basic needs and trying to deconstruct some of that. Like, I'm not supposed to, I don't have to speak into this area. Like, I can really focus my intention on just like listening to like, what do you need? And meeting some of those needs. So I kind of issue that, but I think we are probably well over time. We had to turn off the timer because one of my cute little kiddos did an interruption. So I know we've kind of talked a little bit, but this next podcast next week, we will kind of frame this more in that mental health perspective, like Christy said. So as we kind of wrap up, I want to just give you some time, Christy, because I know you and kind of you'd like to tend to issue a challenge or tend to have kind of a final thought, and just want to give you some space to kind of wrap up this really important conversation around an issue that if you're listening to this in lifetime, I think is very, it's just right at the surface right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say this, I think kind of quickly like covering the gamut a little bit, right? We as clergy and pastors and faith leaders, um, oftentimes we're helping to support people through a lot of different seasons of life. And so I think that your role looks different right now with different seasons that are processing
Mm,
of these pieces and what it means to have grown up in a faith-filled household and what it means to be facilitating growing up in a faith-filled household right now. And so, I would say this, that to individuals that were probably part of raising kids under Dobson and under his predecessors and Gothard and others, be a place that's willing to name that and name that that was painful.
mhm,
Be a place that realizes that some of those older adults in your congregation are estranged from their kids because they don't know how to take responsibility or to be held accountable or to have hard conversations. So how are you naming that? How are you helping to process that and facilitate that? Because that's a thing and that's hard. Similarly, you've got people right now in their, you know, 40s and 50s and late 30s that they grew up under this parenting, and they bear some scars from that. Their souls bear some scars from that. You've got kids that were undiagnosed neurodiverse and ADHD and sensory seeking kiddos who were tormented in church because they couldn't stay quiet, or they would go home and be spanked, and that was holy because they were trying to break the strong will of this child who really just did not have the physical capacity to sit through a 45-minute sermon without rocking their bodies. And so,
mhm,
you've got people in your congregations that this is a thing for them. And it's probably a thing that hasn't been named, hasn't necessarily been healed, because I think we know that there's a very small percentage of people in that age group that are really paying attention and getting some therapy and getting some help specifically around religious trauma and the role that it played in their life. And then
yeah,
similarly, you've got people that are trying to raise kids and they're trying to break some of these cycles. And so finding ways to support them, finding ways to get good resources around people, but more importantly than resources, getting relationships around people. And
mm,
then finally, you've got kids, you've got young adults, you've got teenagers, you've got little people in your church, hopefully. And what are you doing to make sure that you're honoring their own consent and autonomy, that you are honoring their own divine design and how they are created, and you're affirming that in them, and you're shaping that, and you're breathing life into that, not trying to squish that or squelch that? That's a wholly beautiful responsibility. And so,
Mm.
it's a big gamut. It's intimidating and it's hard. And this issue of being raised or raising families in a faith-filled household looks differently for all of those people and all of those generations. So your role as a faith leader is to name these things, talk about these things, facilitate these conversations, and be part of the process of healing.
Mm. I love that. I'm gonna end with just a very short story, kind of going into that. Like when you're thinking about like kids right now that are maybe in church or around people, I got to just witness a really beautiful conversation this summer. My daughter's been asking a lot of questions, and she was actually talking to your middle child, who you just baptized recently. And it was the most beautiful conversation of just she was just talking about something that she's curious about right now. And he just simply asked her like what she believed, and she told him, and his response was, "That's cool. That's really cool." And it was, a little bit far out there, like she's 7. It was something really creative that she constructed, and it was just like the fact that the response to that was, "That's cool," just did my heart so good to just say, like, it wasn't corrective, it wasn't, there was no emotion attached to it in any way, and just how cool that would be. Cool, that word. But how beautiful that would be if that's how the church responded to children as they were constructing what they believe and starting to ask questions and being curious and asking, why that, why do you believe that? And to be able to have this response that's just so gentle and loving and supportive, and like, oh, you're this beautiful little human that's growing up, and like, that's cool. Um, so yeah, I know we've probably gone a little bit over. Like we shared, we'll kind of move into talking about this from the perspective of mental health professionals next week. And then that lived experience and that story piece. So we'll have a little bit more to share, a lot more to share actually. So we're just really grateful that you are along on this journey with us as we're kind of figuring this out in a new podcast and this brand new month, and just really want to give you this invitation to do something for yourself, do something that just fuels your need for whatever that is in this moment. And yeah, we will see you back here next week.
Right. See you next week.